Good afternoon, esteemed guests, speakers, and participants. I'm Anusha, your MC for today. We warmly welcome you to Track 1, Wildlife Trade. We are glad to have you here today to highlight efforts to combat the illegal wildlife trade across Southeast Asia. The 6 speakers today span from multiple Southeast Asian countries. They are from government, NGO, and academic backgrounds. Together, they will share more about their experience in combating illegal wildlife trade in their countries as well as within the region. We would like to thank them in advance for sharing their knowledge with our participants. After 3 speaker talks, we will be holding a panel discussion. If you face any difficulties on Zoom, please feel free to use the Zoom chat to privately message either myself or Lisa, and we will get back to you shortly. We will be joined by our moderator, Mr. Ong Selin, who will be introducing our speakers and facilitating the panel discussion after the sharing in each session. I will now pass the time to Selin to introduce himself. Selin, please.
Thanks very much, Anusha. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Selin, and I'm from Singapore. Today, I'm a volunteer with NParks and your moderator for today's Wildlife Track Trade session. A quick introduction of myself. I've been involved in biodiversity work both within Singapore and the wider ASEAN region, both within the NGO and private sectors. I was previously in Laos for a bit for a wildlife rescue center project, and a bit more recently worked on a monitoring elephant mortality project in national parks across Southeast Asia. And this was for CITES under IUCN together with UNODC. Without further ado, I would like to kickstart.
When I was at Nara Park, Gordon Cove.
Without further ado, I would like to kickstart our talks today for session A. We have with us Dr. Adrian Lu, the Group Director of Wildlife Conservation and the Senior Director, Community Parks of NParks Singapore. Dr. Adrian Lu will share on Singapore's whole-of-government approach to combating illegal wildlife trade, including the work of the Centre for Wildlife Forensics. He will highlight findings from the Centre's recently published paper on the interconnected networks behind large elephant ivory seizures revealed by genetic data, which will direct more focused efforts to counter wildlife trafficking. Dr. Adrian Lu, please.
Thanks, Aileen. Let me just share my screen. Okay, good afternoon, everybody from Singapore and beyond. Thanks for coming to this session, and I welcome the youth and the not so young from the region as well. A special shout out to Giovanni and Kanita, my fellow speakers, also for taking time, and thanks Aileen and Anusha. I want to present on our approach to combating illegal wildlife trade in Singapore. So the international wildlife trade is regulated through the CITES, or the Convention on International Trade in Wildlife, Wild Fauna and Flora. And it's a treaty that's aimed at ensuring that international trade in wild animals and plants do not threaten their survival in the wild. And there are varying degrees of protection of more than 36,000 species of animals and plants by including them in the 3 appendices. And National Parks Board is the CITES authority of Singapore. It's very important that this wildlife trade is regulated because it also gives us enforcement powers through our Endangered Species Act. So when is wildlife trade illegal? It becomes illegal when CITES protected species are smuggled out or sold out of countries without the necessary permits. And such illegal wildlife trade tend to be unsustainable, and it threatens the survival of endangered species globally, and it can lead to possible extinctions, right? And criminals that who are driven by financial gains target these high-value species in demand by consumers, and it puts such species at risk. And not also mentioning the possibility of spreading zoonotic diseases as well. So why should we care? First of all, illegal wildlife trade, it's a global issue and it affects the international community. It reduces biodiversity and disrupts ecosystems through overexploitation, habitat destruction, and introduction of invasive species. It affects our livelihoods and it also destabilizes our economies. The World Economic Forum found that over half of the world's gross domestic product is highly or moderately dependent on nature. And of course, the loss of that biodiversity, if not regulated, can result in the loss of livelihoods and destabilize economies, such as fishing and timber industries. It also increases the risk of disease transmission, as is evident in this day and age. And because illegal wildlife trade evades biosecurity and sanitary controls, it increases the risk of diseases being transmitted from animals to humans, and wildlife of unknown origin will harbor dangerous diseases that could both harm animals and humans as well. And we are very well aware of that in this day and age. So as part of our Singapore's vision of city in nature, we are committed to the global fight against illegal wildlife trade. What is our approach? Our approach is very holistic. It's based on a robust legislative framework, strong enforcement efforts, capacity building and international cooperation, partnerships and community stewardship. Just like what you see today, we get our youth involved as well. We have strict laws and robust legislative framework to regulate the wildlife trade. And apart from the ESA, we also use other legislation like the Corruption, Drug Trafficking, and Other Serious Crimes Act to investigate financial crime as well, so that we can confiscate benefits derived from this illegal wildlife trade. But we do not stop there. While the strict laws are in place, we also have one of the strictest domestic elephant ivory trade bans globally, which was effective from 1st September 2021. We have an active strengthening of domestic laws and enforcements against illegal wildlife trade with public consultation, which ended recently, and we are currently reviewing our law on endangered species, and the whole aim of this is to introduce stiffer penalties and stronger enforcement powers against offenders. We have a whole of government approach that involves the Singapore Customs, our checkpoints authority, and also the police when we need transnational police cooperation for links to financial crimes, investigations, and operations in the international law enforcement. We ourselves do the enforcement as well, and we check transit of CITES specimens as well. We have strong enforcement efforts, and we have a whole of government collaboration, as you saw before that, to carry out inspection of travelers and cargoes at border checkpoints. We recently installed a canine sniffer dog unit as well to be deployed to support border control agencies to detect wildlife contraband at border checkpoints. It's an action-oriented approach based on intelligence reports, and we do a serious assessment of every credible and actionable intelligence tip-off. And this has resulted in several successful seizures that was highlighted before as well. So we collaborate with our partners such as CITES, UNODC, Giovanni later on will speak, Interpol, and the World Customs Organization. We work with NGOs like WWF on a cyber spotter program, as well as ACRES and Traffic, and Kanita from Traffic is here today as well. We also collaborate with technology companies like Google and Microsoft to develop tools to address illegal wildlife trade activities online, and also on technologies that will help enforcement officers as well on the ground. And we do industry engagements with traditional Chinese merchant shops, shipping and e-commerce platforms too. So this is to highlight one of the record pangolin seizure that we had in 2019, 3rd April 2019. It was 0.9 tons of pangolin scales worth about 52 million Sing dollars. It was hidden behind 230 bags. It was hidden behind packets of frozen beef and there were 230 big bags of pangolin scales. We also found co-mingled with these pangolin scales 177 kg of cut up and processed elephant ivory. This was a joint ops with our Singapore customs, and we estimated that this came from scales from 17,000 pangolins. It's a world record haul. On the 8th April, that's about a week later, we had a second seizure, and this was in a 40-foot container that was transiting on its way from Nigeria onward to other country. It was 12.7 tons, just shy of that record, packed in 474 bags and worth about 41 million. And we estimated that there were 21,000 pangolins, because pangolins are of various species. The first one we had was from 4 species, and this particular seizure we had 2 species. So personally, what was really heartbreaking to see was the claws of the pangolin and these big patches of scale. And as we were doing the enforcement, halfway we were wondering how many pangolins actually were killed because of this, and how much biodiversity was actually extracted from the forest because of this. So these were the 4 species. Thanks to US aid guide, we could actually identify which were the ones. And this becomes very important information for us as well. And we collected samples for further study. So it was also inspired by this that we decided to increase our capacity and develop our capabilities, basically. And not only our capabilities, but work with organizations globally to work on wildlife forensics. So it's anchored by these advisors, a panel of advisors that we collaborate with to look at seizures that we have done, to analyze them through chemical means, through morphological means as well. And this center basically strengthens our capability in some of the detection and diagnostic efforts in our research as well, capabilities through things like DNA work, as well as mass spectrometry as well. So this Center for Wildlife Forensics is based on 3 main strategies in detection. So we use genetics. DNA is one of the main things that we use, because all life has DNA. We also have been developing capabilities in wood identification, and we are forming a xylarium. Basically, it's a collection of wood reference samples. It might seem like what is there in a wood reference sample, right? A library, but it's a very important reference for us to actually compare illegal wildlife seizures to what is actually illegal and what's legal. So it's very important in our enforcement efforts. We also collect data information and look at species identification. So you can see here some worked ivory, and very clearly there are Schreger lines that are associated with elephant tusks. So in the photo on the right, you'll see someone in the hat there, this bucket cap. He's Professor Samuel Wazer. He's been a really powerful and really passionate researcher that has worked on the ecology of Africa. And he also worked with us and helped us to analyze the ivory seizures that we made. And this was a seizure of about 300 elephants. And based on the genetics and trait data, and we plugged into a global study, we found that a lot of the majority of the ivory seizures made globally resulted from repeated poaching from a localized elephant population in the Kaza region, and sometimes even in the same family groups. And it gave us insights into patterns and the networks of how some of these syndicates work. So we have published that information, and hopefully it will be useful for enforcement agencies in the source country to be able to target certain areas as well and focus their efforts on certain areas. So today, we also work closely with a lot of our partners, and we try to foster community stewardship. And today is an example of how we can tap partnerships. The people that we've invited, some of them are people we know, and some of them are people we will get to know as well. And so fosters the kind of collaboration that is needed to fight illegal wildlife trade, which is a global problem. We have organized workshops with NGOs like WWF to raise awareness among the industry and strengthen partnerships. Example, commerce platforms and the maritime sector. And of course, I mentioned Google and Microsoft are helping us with technology to develop tools that can detect and identify wildlife contraband as well. So for our efforts, yes, our minister has already highlighted that we have been awarded this award by the UN Asia Environmental Enforcement Award. We are also a board member in the Interpol Wildlife Crime Working Group, where we actively participate in. This Wildlife Crime Working Group is a very important platform because it brings the global enforcement agencies into a platform where we meet regularly and develop networks to better fight illegal wildlife trade as well. So what can you do? It's very important that we organize ourselves better than the illegal wildlife crime networks. So number one is, of course, you can what Mrs. Mundita Lim said, we can encourage, or what our society SecGen said, we can encourage our family and friends not to buy illegal wildlife products. We can share more of what we learned today. We can aspire to work towards fighting illegal wildlife trade as well, and we can aspire to work in conservation as well. And in today's symposium, you'll see that a lot of the speakers here have dedicated their lives to fighting illegal wildlife trade or work towards conservation of many species or habitats. So we can aspire to do that as well. Okay, with that, I'd like to thank everyone for your attention, and hopefully we can have a good panel discussion later on. Thanks everyone. Anusha, Celine, I'll just
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Dr. Adrian Du. Certainly really interesting hearing about all the collaborations that your team in MPARKS has, both within the different agencies in Singapore and external groups. And also the exciting developments from the Wildlife Forensics Center. I would now like to welcome another veteran in the fight against illegal wildlife trade in the region. Today we have Ms. Kanita Krishnasamy, Director of Traffic in Southeast Asia. Today, Kanita's presentation will summarize some of the most pressing issues and threats facing the Earth's most rare, charismatic, and threatened species, along with some thoughts on solutions to protect species from the illegal and unsustainable wildlife trade. Ms. Kanita, please.
Thanks, Celine. Veteran threw me off a little bit, but I guess it's totally apt here with the group of youngsters that we have with us here today. Happy World Wildlife Day. First of all, thanks to NPARKS for inviting me and Traffic for being part of this wonderful event. So I've got the next 10 minutes or so to briefly take you through some of the work that Traffic is doing right here in Southeast Asia. We've got the organizers to help manage my slides. So I'll prompt you guys, and I'm going to start off with an issue that is very highly topical and debated right now, especially right here in Southeast Asia, where illegal trade is concerned. Next, please. illegal online wildlife trade. It is as dizzying as that video. It's too fast, it's too much, it's too quick, it's too complicated. And it is a massive issue that governments all around the world are struggling with today, particularly in a lot of countries, especially here in Southeast Asia, that may not have had the market, the shop or the place where you can actually walk into and exchange money and purchase an animal. This online platform has now essentially functioned as the supermarket where you can buy and sell animals basically at the tip of your fingertips. But it's not just live animals, as you saw in the video clip. Across Southeast Asia, a lot of animal parts are also being sold largely illegally. Next, please. On the left is the critically endangered helmeted hornbill, confined to a small range of 5 countries right here in Southeast Asia. And of course, we all know the rhino on the right. Next. And these animals are being targeted for basically for the creation of jewelry, parts and products as trinkets, and of course for use in traditional medicine. Each one of these images here were taken from traffic surveys in a single country just a couple of years ago. Next. Pangolins, unfortunately famous for all the wrong reasons. They are popularly known as the world's most trafficked mammal, and that attribution is because of the significant volume that have been confiscated across the world. We heard from Adrian earlier of the work that NParks is doing, and this is really what is happening across the entire region, where significant volumes of pangolin parts are coming in and through Southeast Asia, particularly in the form of scales, which is exactly what is the image right in the center. These are, wait for it, deep-fried pangolin scales, which is used for traditional medicinal purposes. They are being shipped across the world, not just here in Asia. There have been quite a number of shipments that are heading to North America and Europe as well, again, priced for traditional medicinal use. The image on the right, there are similar products like that. They are used sometimes as pendants or sometimes as for coining purposes, which is an ancient use of sort of scraping your skin, and it's meant to provide healing properties. And so, pangolin scales, critically endangered species, are being targeted for such use. Next, please. We've heard from Adrian earlier about the massive confiscations that have taken place in Singapore, which is the image on the left. And it's not just happening in Singapore, it's happening across Asia, both in Asia and in the African continent, where a lot of these products are originating from. And it's not just about animals. The image on the right is confiscation of rosewood. It is luxury timber that is used for luxury purposes to produce a whole range of furniture and other products as luxury goods. And this was a particular seizure that took place in Sri Lanka, and large volumes of this timber is actually coming in and through Southeast Asia, across pretty much most of Southeast Asia. And we see these such large volumes of wildlife parts and products that are being moved through containers across continents. And these sort of movements, it's not something that you and I can do quite easily. You need a pretty significant network to be able to do this quite easily and consistently across decades, across continents. Next, please. It's not just these parts and products that are crossing the continents. This is just one example of a confiscation that was made by authorities in Sumatra. Significant volume of live birds are being confiscated to feed the cage bird trade. Next. Bird trade is very popular across Asia. This particular image was taken in Indonesia, but this really is not an issue just in Indonesia. We've been working with a few of our partners in Indonesia, and over 170,000 individual birds have been confiscated in several locations in just Sumatra. That's 170,000 individual birds. Some of them alive, some of them don't make it. And they are being packed in crates, in cages, stuffed in private vehicles, in makeshift compartments, in buses. And this is really a huge problem that authorities are grappling with, because yes, you're stopping the confiscation, you're stopping, these birds from reaching their end destination to an illegal market, but then you're left with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of birds that have been taken from the wild. So it causes a lot of other complications as well. Next. The next series of images are about some of the examples in trafficking. I've talked earlier about these products that we see in the markets where they are openly available for trade. But in order for that to happen, traffickers are moving things across various means of transportation. This was a particular image taken 3 World Wildlife Days ago, in fact, in the Philippines, when over 1,500 tortoises had arrived from Hong Kong. A significant number of them was Indian star tortoise. This is a very popular species of tortoise for the exotic pet trade in Malaysia, in Singapore, in Thailand, in Indonesia, and in the Philippines. And these are usually how they are packed in suitcases. Unfortunately, they are wrapped, as you can see, in tapes to prevent them from moving. And suitcases were a very popular means of trafficking animals up until a couple of years ago, when COVID sort of threw everything off a little bit, and there was a little bit of a reprieve, I guess. Next one. Again, continuing on the whole trafficking by suitcase, these was a particular example of an individual who packed 2 orangutans in a suitcase in a car, and he was moving it across the Malaysia-Thai border. Thankfully, the Thai authorities were able to stop this individual, and the animals were rescued. Next. This was a pretty interesting case. Our staff in Thailand was at the Bangkok airport having a meeting with airport authorities, and they all got a call and they rushed to the scene of the crime, where this lady had packed the suitcase and she was checking it through the scanning machine, where authorities looking at the scanning machine had stopped the bag and they took it out. And when they opened the bag, it's not very clear from this image, but on the top, the lighter image is actually a soft toy of a tiger. Below it, spanning across the entire luggage, is a live tiger, is a baby cub, which she was trying to smuggle from Thailand to Iran, completely drugged. Next, please. If the authorities had not been vigilant and stopped this person, this cub would have most certainly died, because it was fully drugged. And really, it was sheer luck that the authorities were able to stop this, because it didn't come to intelligence investigation. So it's absolutely important that enforcement agencies at various ports of transportation remain vigilant to the issue of illegal trade and trafficking. Next, please. Some go to extreme lengths. This was a particular confiscation in Macau. The set of images on the left, as you can see, they're sort of brownish and they're coated with a layer of chocolate. They were smuggling it as chocolate. So they were packed as chocolate, wrapped in chocolate packaging. And the only reason this was stopped was because, again, authorities' vigilance, they realized that chocolates don't weigh as much. And when they stopped the bag, they peeled through and cracked through the layers. They found ivory pieces. So a lot of individuals are really going through, I suppose, various means and efforts to try and smuggle these items to the easiest means that they think that they can get away with. Next, please. Some are not so smart. These 2 examples, these 2 individuals got caught at the airport. The guy on the left, he was stopped because there was a whole pile of bird poop on his shoes. He was flying, and obviously he got caught. The lady on the right also was stopped because there was a whole pile of swooshing sound. She had packed a whole pile of tropical fish underneath her skirt, and fortunately the agencies were able to stop her. Next, please. So these are all just some of the examples, right? And none of them are really new. They have existed for a really, really long time, perhaps with the exception of how online platforms have functioned over the last decade and a half or so, and how they continue to evolve. So if you could just go next, maybe 4 or 5 steps. 2 more. Yes. Okay. So really, all of these issues have persisted for a really, really long time. We've heard from Adrian that legislation is being modified in Singapore, and this is not just happening in Singapore. Quite a number of countries in Southeast Asia are improving the legislation, which is great, right? The starting point is to have a strong legislation where you've got strict provisions within the law and you've got high fines. But if it's only good on paper and it's not being implemented and enforced, then it has no bite. And so this is where the intelligence-led investigations are absolutely crucial. Shutting down of markets that are openly selling things like these images of ivory that you see here, where it is against national law. They have to go hand in hand. Having strong laws alone is insufficient. If the confiscations that have taken place for ivory and pangolin scales, for example, it's great. It has stopped these items from reaching the end destination or from criminal organizations from profiting. But if these seizures are made without the identification of the individuals behind them, the arrest of the people who've been involved, the prosecution of these individuals, and the conviction of these individuals, then in the grander scheme of things, we're actually not making a dent, because these individuals are just going to go ahead and continue their business as usual, which means that one particular shipment or a series of particular shipments have been stopped, but they're going to go out there and target more animals and catch them and trade in them and traffic in them. It's not just about law enforcement against traders and traffickers. Consumers have a massive role to play in this. And I think this is something that really needs to be profiled a little bit more, because they are the ones who are driving the demand. They are the ones who are driving the supply that is basically giving criminal organizations jobs and profiting from these businesses. So it's not just about law enforcement against traders and traffickers. Consumers also have to be held accountable. Private sector bodies are equally involved in all of this. Online trade platforms, for example, are involved because they are the platforms that are offering these products, but it's not just them. In order for a commodity, any commodity, to reach both traders and consumers, you have to move these products. And so logistics and transportation sectors are also involved, and they do have a role to play. And of course, a lot of this really boils down to political will. Corruption is a huge problem across the world, really, not just here in Southeast Asia. And it's great that many governments are making a lot of pledges, and perhaps making a pledge is the starting point, it's the easy step. But if pledges are not accompanied with people with the right resources, with the right skills, with the right expertise, and with the money that is able, or rather that enables governments and the partners that they're working with to tackle this in a meaningful way, we're not going to get ahead of the game at all. As Arian said later, we have to get smarter, we have to get ahead of the criminals, and we are unfortunately nowhere near there at all. A lot more needs to happen. And these are the suite of areas in which traffic is working on. We do a lot of market monitoring and investigation and research, of course, but we're also working with government agencies and with private sector partners, including those in the airline and the transportation and the logistics sector, to try and bring them on board, to see how they as companies can be more actively engaged in this issue, not just in terms of tackling the problem after it has happened, but also in terms of preventing trafficking from taking place. Next, please. So this is really my last slide. There's so much of work going on across the world, and traffic is involved in a whole range of issues. A lot of our information is actually made available on our website. So please feel free to check our website for any new information or new materials or new tools, or some of the new research that we are working on or we have put out. The Traffic Office in Southeast Asia also has its dedicated Facebook page, and the page is really quite focused about issues right here in Southeast Asia. So if anyone is interested in learning more, in reaching out to us, please do get in touch with us through our social media channels. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kanita. Always very, insightful hearing from the hard work that traffic puts into the market investigations in the field and the photos that come out of it. Thanks very much again. I think you've answered some of the panel discussion questions actually in one sweep, but later on we'll talk into some of the topics a little bit deeper. Our next guest, our next speaker is Dr. Giovanni Broussard. I'd like to welcome Dr. Giovanni Broussard, who is the Regional Coordinator for Asia Pacific of UNODC Global Program on Wildlife and Forest Crimes. Today, Giovanni will highlight that wildlife crime is not only an environmental issue, but also an issue of great relevance for the security and rule of law in our societies. His presentation will share that within ASEAN, there are clear challenges, but also opportunities to be seized to offer a better future to the next generations. Without further ado, Giovanni, good to see you here on this forum. You have the floor, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Celine. Good to see you. Thank you for not using the word veteran in referring to me. And thanks also, Anusha, for organizing everything and giving me all the information to be prepared here today in this panel with two experts like Adrian and Kanita that have spoken already so eloquently about the problem. And I think that they have probably said already most of the important things that you need to be aware of. But I just wanted to add a few words mainly to explain a little bit the evolution also of the response to these crimes by many of the governments here in Asia and also the international organizations. I work for an organization of the United Nations that deals specifically with the issue of drug trafficking and organized crime. So traditionally, we work a lot on issues like human trafficking, terrorism, corruption, money laundering, drug trafficking. And I remember when back more or less in 2010, a small group of us started to talk more about the issue of environmental crimes and specifically wildlife crime. And I must say that even within my organization, a lot of our colleagues were looking at us as a little bit of a crazy group of people because we were talking about things that were still perceived to be slightly small environmental issues. And even when we were talking to the governments in Asia, many governments in Asia, we were essentially told that wildlife crime is really just maybe rural people going into the forest and kill a few animals to provide for the families, but it's not really that serious of an issue. And again, that was the general misconception about wildlife crime, that it was very common to hear about 10, 15 years ago. We tried always to explain that we are not really trying to criminalize the behavior of a farmer or a villager who goes and gets some bushmeat to the family. We were mainly talking about commercial organized enterprises that manage to poach in industrial scale and move across countries and continents highly endangered species. And that was really not a matter of subsistence for farmers. That was purely transnational organized crime. And slowly the understanding of this difference started to sink in many governments and in many international organizations. There were a few events that certainly contributed to change the mentality towards illegal wildlife trade. Certainly the carnage of pangolins in Asia, to which both Adrian and Kanita alluded, was important. Nobody knew what pangolins are. And all of a sudden, people started to hear about the most trafficked mammal in the world. I remember when I started to work in this sector, every week there were confiscations of thousands and thousands of pangolins here in Asia. But what really surprised me is that when the Asian pangolin was essentially brought to the brink of extinction, I would have assumed that the trade would have stopped. Instead, traffickers started to source pangolins from Africa, from the other species of pangolins that existed in Africa. And from that moment, there was an intense transcontinental movement of pangolin scales from Africa to Asia, of which Adrian told us those 2 seizures in 2019 in Singapore are 2 of the biggest ever seizures. And again, congratulations to Singapore for how they handled this whole situation. 25 tons of pangolin scale, corresponding to a ridiculous amount of animals that were killed to provide for these unscientific remedies for traditional medicines. Then there was the crisis of the rhinoceros in South Africa. At some point, again, there was a misconception that a concoction, some powder of rhino horns, could be used to cure cancer or other forms of medicines. And all of a sudden, in a few years, the number of killed rhinoceros without the horn went from a few units in 2007 to over 1,200 in 2015. In just 7 years, the number of rhinoceros that were killed went just through the roof. Considering that the population of rhinoceros is relatively small, so those numbers are really endangering the survival of these species. And then there were these confiscation of elephant tusks, ivory coming from Africa going to Asia. They were happening really on weekly basis, if not monthly basis, but there were really tons and tons of ivory being moved from Africa to Asia. And again, Singapore and many other countries in Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, China, did very big confiscations of ivory shipments. At that point, I think the world started to realize that this is really a serious issue. This is not something that we can categorize anymore as a tiny environmental hiccups that can be fixed with a little alternative development approach. It has to be approached as a fight against organized crime that requires also law enforcement. There were a few other examples where probably the amounts of animals that were killed were not so much, but they were so those animals were so popular that they really touched into the sensitivity of the societies. The picture that Kanita showed us of this tiger cub being trafficked at the airport in Bangkok was quite indicative of the audacity that traffickers and couriers were using, thinking they could carry in their handbag a live tiger cub across continents. Or some of you may remember also the killing of the lion Cecil in Zimbabwe, just one animal that has been killed, but it became worldwide news. For some reason, this lion was very famous in Zimbabwe, and when a tourist actually killed this lion, shot this lion, there was an uproar worldwide for the situation. Something similar happened in Thailand when a billionaire tycoon a few years ago killed a black leopard in a protected area. And all of a sudden, there was an uproar led really by the youth of Thailand that took the street to complain about the impunity, the corruption that potentially surrounded this case. So in this we see how the killing of individual animals have generated a lot of awareness in the society, and all these things contribute contributed to change the winds. And now there is much more awareness about the importance of combating wildlife crime. So now we are in a situation where every year we have different resolution at the United Nations in different bodies that whereby government commits to take more measures to combat wildlife crime. There is more money that is donated by foundation, by governments to assist countries that are struggling the most with the issue of wildlife crime. There are more NGOs, conservationists that work in this field. There are regional bodies that are created even within ASEAN, specifically focused on combating wildlife crime. International conferences and meetings that are happening every year, every quarter of the year. I organize myself many of these conferences, and I may myself contributing inadvertently to create also some fatigue towards these continuous amount of events. But have we solved the problem yet? Not really, especially because until COVID, the volumes of trafficking were the highest ever. Then with COVID, there was a little bit of a slowdown, and now we are witnessing a new emergence again. But until COVID, the trafficking was as big as ever. Are we close to a solution? No, because criminals still enjoy very high impunity, as also Kanita said. There are some good laws in place, but very often they are not enforced properly, and they don't lead to very good convictions in courts. But there are some clear improvements. Government really starts to take it seriously, to cooperate with one another, because they understand that no single country can solve this transnational issue. And Singapore is one of the countries that succeeds the most in cooperating with other countries, understood the importance of working with other countries. And Adrian showed us some successful examples of cooperation that leads to arrest, prosecution, convictions, changes of policies as well. So I'm really glad to be talking today to a generation of future leaders and future policymakers, because I really think that it's crucial that you understand more than anybody else that combating wildlife crime is really a priority, not only for the protection of fauna and flora of the planet in which we live, but also because it's essential to bring social and environmental justice to this generation and to the next generation. So I just joined the other speakers in asking you to be very careful about your whole approach to nature and environment, even when you go to facilities, zoos, or whatever facility with animals. Document yourself on what's the background of this facility. Just try to make sure that they're not potentially illegal activities. Before going and pet a tiger cub and taking some photos, think about the consequences. Don't buy suspicious products, a beautiful piece of ivory that you may find in a market. Think about what you're supporting in the moment when you buy these things. Or if you come across online groups that are dealing with wildlife species, do consider to report them to the authorities. So that's it from my side, and I'm happy to take any question if there is any. Back to you, Sadie.
Thanks very much, Giovanni. That was really interesting. I mean, I liked your, open-ended and general speaking of bringing us through time 15 years ago, that slow realization that environmental crime is extremely serious and organized. Thanks very much for that again. So now we'll go to a session, a discussion session. We've prepared actually two categories of questions. The first category is on general discussion, and the next category is on career advice.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. I'll ask him to call you. Yeah. Thank you.
I think I'll open up the question to everyone. Maybe we'll start by personal goals. So in terms of in the general discussion question, I have a question here. What is your personal goal in combating against illegal wildlife trade? What is the end game or realistic end game do you actually see in this ongoing fight against illegal wildlife trade? I think it's open to anyone, Adrian, Kanita, or Giovanni, to take this question.
I can go first. Yeah, so that I can quickly go first, and then the rest can go as well. I guess my own personal goal is, a healthy appreciation of nature and a healthy coexistence with nature by everyone. But we must never think that we are close to that goal because, like Alice in Wonderland, she ran as fast as possible to stay in the same place. We must do that, because the syndicates, the criminal networks are very organized as well. And for us to be, for us to fight illegal wildlife trade, we must be as organized. We must come together, and that's one of the motivations actually for this symposium as well. And we've always got the support from Kanita from Traffic and Giovanni as well. And I think in the panel of speakers there will be Sally and also member states like Miss Clarong Punpon from Thailand as well. And then we also take inspiration from people like Ruben, who's in this panel of speakers also. So we need to come together and be more organized. So that's my personal take on this. Yeah.
Any further comments on this, Kanita and Giovanni? What is the end goal do you actually hope for?
Sure. I think if you ask us, we all have many, many, many wishes that, we would like to see happen. But, looking at this purely from the perspective of how wildlife crime is so prominent, we have to stop the carnage. And one of the things that we've been pushing for a really long time is that we just have to catch the bad guys, to put it quite simply. If we don't get these guys, this carnage is just going to continue. We're already losing too many species here in Southeast Asia too fast. And if we don't get ahead of the game, I think we are already on that path now where so many more species are on that brink. And if we don't act quickly, I think we're just going to lose too many of them way too quickly, and it's just going to be too late to do anything. We have to get ahead of the game right now. Thanks.
And
Thanks, Kanita. Yeah, go ahead, Giovanni.
yeah, and I'll probably just echo what Kanita just said. My end game is to make life really, really terrible for traffickers and criminals that try to take advantage by the exploitation of these natural resources. I would like them to be terrified at the idea of spending so much time in jail, losing all the money that they have accumulated, to the point that they would not dare to take away from nature animals, species that belong to nature, and to move them across countries, across continents, just for decoration of or traditional medicines. There is a legal trade that exists, and I think that the operators that work in this legal trade of wildlife can operate within the rules, within the limits of sustainability, rules that are clearly set, and that there are not criminals that try to operate beyond those rules. I would like those criminals to be really scared about the consequences of their illegal activities. And when that happens, probably there will also be a situation when these natural resources, ivory, rhino horns, tiger bones, pangolin scales, will not be available anymore on markets. So I think that that's my end game.
Thanks very much, Adrian, Kanita, and Giovanni. So it looks like while we stay positive, none of us will be switching lines very soon because there's a lot of work to do. And I like how we talk about the end game for the organized criminals as well. So I'll switch over to a career advice question. I'd like to ask our panel here, could you share briefly about your own personal journey and how you became a specialist in this fight against illegal wildlife trade? And also maybe you can just touch on a little bit on what you think youth today can equip themselves with, the kind of skills that you think they need to help in this fight. I think this question is quite interesting because all three of you have probably come from quite a slightly different background and are now collaborating in different ways in this fight against illegal wildlife trade. So a little bit about your personal journey, how you achieve being where you are right now, and what are some kind of skills that you think the youth should have today.
Kanita, you go first.
Just going to call on you, but okay, I'll go first. So mine was interesting in the sense that I studied forestry in Sabah. For those of you who've not been Sabah, it's one of the greatest places to go where nature conservation is concerned. And every semester break there was always a trip into the field, and I think that was perhaps the initial phase to giving me that sense of just how great nature is. But the true turning point for me really was when I started working at the Malaysian Nature Society. So after university, I interned at the Malaysian Nature Society. For those of you in Singapore, if you're familiar with NSS, it's the equivalent here in Malaysia. And MNS is the largest membership-based conservation organization in Malaysia. And it was probably the best thing for me because, I was exposed to so much. When I first joined MNS, there was a time when they were organizing expeditions into the forest to, to document biodiversity and to use that for policy and for planning purposes for better management of habitats and protected areas. And I was able to go out there and meet a lot of experts who were doing research in the field, to engage with a whole range of government agencies, to work with like-minded individuals, MNS members who were not, in the conservation field, but they had so much interest and so much passion. And it was, I think, it was a great recipe, combining the exposure to wildlife. Every other week there was a trip into the field. There were specialist groups for bird watching, for marine and diving, for insects, for plants. And it was really a great exposure for appreciating nature. And then I worked with MNS for about 8 years, and I moved to traffic. And obviously, based on everything that I've said earlier about the work of traffic, it's really quite different. From experiencing nature in the wild, I was exposed and involved a lot more in terms of how these animals were being traded and trafficked. And so a combination of all of that, I think, is what drove me to continue in this path, in this career. And a big chunk of that took place in my youth. If I was not involved at that time, I don't think I would have stuck with it as much as I think Celine, was it you who said that we're in this career for a long time? And a lot of that really happened during my youth. I was very interested to learn more. And this touches on your second question, Celine, in terms of what is important for youth today. And I think that's what is important. The curiosity is what drove me, and not being afraid of asking questions, especially youth today. Gosh, youth today is totally different to when I was a youth. The world is a totally different place today than it was before. And there's really no excuse to say that you don't know, gone are the days where you're sort of waiting for the newspapers to arrive in your house in the morning to know what's going on in the rest of the world. Today, everything is on your phone. You know exactly what's going on the other side of the world. And so there's so much access to information, which actually gives youth today a much better footing and a platform to get more actively engaged in this issue. The voice of the people is so crucially strong. Giovanni talked earlier about how the youth was such a massive driving factor in terms of what happened in Thailand when the panther was poached. And imagine if that was multiplied across the entire world. I think it's such a powerful voice to send to decision makers and to politicians. I know we all get easily dismayed with politics and everything that's going on in the world right now, but the power of the people is very, very strong. And I think in today's world, the voice of the youth is extremely strong. And I think we just have to empower youth to use that voice. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kanita. It's really inspiring indeed. Not sure if Adrian or Giovanni
Giovanni,
would like to
please.
also chip in. Giovanni, I'm not sure if you are also from a forestry background, but obviously UNODC, Office of Drugs and Crime. I'm guessing maybe you're from a law enforcement background. So, it'd be interesting to hear from you how you came to be in this line of fighting environmental crime and wildlife trade specifically.
I actually am still trying to answer that question myself every day. I don't know. I studied economics, in fact, back in Italy, quite a few years ago. But I tried to develop a specific focus on environmental aspects of economics. Then I started to work with an NGO that was dealing with issues of criminal justice. I found myself also going to Afghanistan a few times and working on criminal justice there. And when I eventually joined the UN, I happened to be lucky enough to have a boss that asked me to combine my background in environmental economics with my experience in criminal justice. And there you go, developing a program on environmental crimes. I did again, my background is mainly economics, but there is a little bit of a international law elements there. I did a PhD in environmental issues and the link between poverty reduction and environmental policies. So that was my academic background. But I really ended up working in the field of environmental crime a little bit by chance. But it has really become the passion of my life. And I think that I wouldn't work within the UN in any other area than this one. It's the most meaningful and the most relevant to me.
Nice. Thanks, Giovanni. Thanks for sharing. Adrian, I think we have 2 minutes in this panel discussion.
Right, thanks. Actually,
Like to
Celine
add?
would have, would be an inspiration to everyone. Also, you worked in Mike, and you actually uprooted yourself to Thailand and, worked to monitor the killing of elephants. Yeah, that's very inspiring. I know Celine well. We belong to a group of, biodiversity community in Singapore. We love our forests, we love our wildlife. I spent a large time in Peninsular Malaysia under the Forest Research Institute of Malaysia. My supervisor, Solengwan, was there and he brought me to the field. We worked with orang aslis. It was a wonderful time. I spent a lot of time in our Singapore forest as well. So it almost comes like, this job almost comes like a natural, extension that we want to protect wildlife. And one of the ways is to fight illegal wildlife trade. So that's somehow evolved. I'm glad to know that, we always question ourselves, what are we doing here? Catching people, enforcement. I never really thought of myself as a policeman for, nature, but it's become something like that, right? Yeah, but we are protecting what we love, I think. Yeah.
Thanks, Adrian. Okay, so just to wrap up this panel discussion, so what we are really hearing from these 3 great speakers is that this trade or environmental protection is really multifaceted, and we have to put ourselves in the right positions basically to take opportunities. And sometimes, like Giovanni, convincing your peers that environmental crime is something that is really important to look at, and then that kicks off a movement as well. So thanks very much again, Adrian, Kanita, and Giovanni. We'll move on to session B, and we have another 3 speakers here to share with us. We'll start with Professor Gopalasamy Ruben Clements. He's the Associate Dean of Research and Postgraduate Studies from Sunway University, Malaysia. In this session, Ruben will share 3 tips on how to get involved in wildlife conservation and highlight some of the impact that his teams have had in wildlife conservation in Peninsular Malaysia over the last 15 years. Let us welcome Ruben. Ruben, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Celine, and everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm going to share my screen. All right. So today I'm going to share with you 12 years of our wildlife conservation work in Kenya, in the state of Terengganu, in Peninsular Malaysia. And I'm going to present to you a model in which how we tackle the illegal wildlife trade at the source by having boots on the ground to reduce poaching. Thanks for the introduction, Celine. So my day job, I'm a professor at a private university called Sunway University. And I used to be the vice president of an NGO called RIMBA, and we just closed our NGO. But we have spawned 4 new NGOs, which I won't talk about today. But ultimately, whatever we did here, presenting to you was the work of the team that I built in RIMBA, and not just RIMBA, but we also have our donors, our partners together working with us in the same landscape. And this is one of the NGOs that we incubated, is Panthera Malaysia, and I'm presenting the work to you today from the rest of my partners as well. And I'm sure you've heard about snaring being one of the most critical threats to wildlife. Yes, in countries like Malaysia, there's examples of how snares are put in the forest, and we are trying our best to remove cable snares that we see because they are the #1 threat to animals with 4 legs on the ground. And tigers, as you see in the picture here, get caught, and it's really, really tough to rescue once tigers lose their legs. And we have incidents where we have 3-legged animals walking around, tigers, sun bears, and that's something we want to try to avoid. So one of the ways in which we try to reduce snaring was really getting people on the ground. So this is the first ever civilian wildlife anti-poaching unit that I formed in 2008 when I was working in WWF Malaysia. This is the team, band of brothers that we formed, that we helped arrest 10 poachers in that year, and we removed more than 115 snares in the Belum Temanggung Forest Complex. So after that, I decided to leave and set up my own project in Terengganu, and that's when RIMBA started. So this is where I work in this landscape. It's a beautiful watershed. It's called the Kenya watershed, about 200,000 hectares, and you've got limestone hills here. And if you're lucky, you can see maybe tigers also lurking in the distance among these limestone hills. And not just tigers, we also have leopards and clouded leopards. These are the 3 big cats that we find in the area. So in 2014, Panthera, one of our partners, came and we set up this Harimau Selamanya project, really to try to address one of the problems, which was the illegal wildlife trade, especially of big cats like tigers and other wildlife. And we have identified that, well, a lot of the times the problems come from regions outside Malaysia, like Indochina. There's syndicates in Vietnam that actually, based on research, and we have found to be the greatest threat to big cats like tigers. So people are recruited in country, and they travel either over land, taking Air Asia, for example, or also taking trawlers, come into Malaysia, where they start preparing to poach, and then they transport the wildlife goods for consumption in areas such as Vietnam and China. So this is one of the illegal wildlife trade routes that we're trying to stop at the source. So we are trying to get patrollers out there to keep poachers at bay. And in Kenya, we formed an excellent team of all Malaysian, but ranging from Orang Aslis, different sub-ethnic groups. We also have people from Borneo, Sabah, and Sarawak working in our team. So it's really a one Malaysia all team. I'm the only foreigner, a Singaporean there, but I'm glad to have such a team of dedicated heroes on the ground trying to locate poaching gangs and remove snares for the last, let's say, 10 years. But since 2014, our patrols have achieved these amazing statistics. We've conducted numerous patrols and removed more than 200 over cable snares, as well as helped the wildlife department arrest 33 poachers to date. And this involves really a lot of walking. And how, I'll just give some snapshot of how we do it. This is the patrol operations that I think a lot of you may not be privy to, but I'm just going to share with you how it all starts from from the patrol planning. That's a really important part where we collect data on the ground and we actually have a team briefing. Our rangers are prepped and briefed where to go, what to look out for, and then we usually send out teams of between 4 to 5 members to go out there. And most patrols are actually on foot. We don't have vehicles going to the forest. Our teams carry about 25 to 30 kilos of backpacks, and patrols are usually typically 6 to 10 days long in the forest. And it's not for people who are not used to the forest. Even for me, as from Singapore, it took a while for me to get used to the terrain. I think National Service prepared me for this. And I think what we do is we go out in a team, we look for signs of poaching. And so it could be just something like this, a cut on a twig or some scribbles on the bark of a tree. It could be messages for other poachers to see. So once we see all these fresh signs, and then we actually carefully examine them and decide, okay, what kind of poachers these are. And then we also look for fresh footprints. So all these allow us to try to locate areas where snares might be set. So once we go to find if we find an active snare, what we do is initially we tried to remove active snares because we want to keep animals safe, but ultimately we felt that it was just not really solving the problem. What we want is to actually have the poachers arrested. So once we see active snare and the wildlife there's no wildlife in the trap, what we do is actually we know that the poachers are around, so we conduct search operations and we immediately alert our base command to alert the wildlife authorities to come and get ready to catch poachers. So we're not just about just removing snares anymore. We actually want to try to apprehend the people setting them. So what happens was the HQ in our field base, we will coordinate the relevant law enforcement agencies, have backup teams ready, and the search operations for the camps could take from just few hours to 2 weeks. That's our record. And we actually plan a very systematic approach based on the knowledge of the poacher behavior and their movement patterns based on our data. So once we find an active poaching camp, we then conduct what you call a close target reconnaissance. These are skills that have been trained. We've learned from ex-army fellas who train our guys to do this. It's not for everyone. It's not for the faint-hearted. And this is something that also National Service did prepare me for. But again, we have very experienced ex-commandos, for example, who help us do this. And once we find a camp, there will be an ambush plan that will be discussed, and then we'll sync up with the relevant law enforcement authorities, because at the end of the day, as civilians, we cannot catch poachers. The ambush team led by the wildlife department has to do it. So we actually work with them, plan out the area of how they're ambushed. And once that happens, when the poachers are arrested, there's also post-arrest interviews to find out more about their modus operandi, and also debrief sessions to see where we went wrong and what lessons can be learned. And then we critically assess what went well and what did not, so that we can improve and get better. So this whole system in place here. It's not just going out there looking for snares. It's not so simple, but what we pride ourselves is also having a training program where we invite other law enforcement agencies and other NGOs. As Kanita mentioned just now, there are a lot of Malaysian NGOs working on anti-poaching. We invite them, we train together, we learn from one another to do counter-poaching field tactics, and we share all our experiences, learn, and we also have all these scenario-based learning to let rangers practice skills in a safe but realistic environment. So we have actually just published the Deep Forest Counter-Poaching Operations Guide, so that this is what we plan to roll out and have all the other NGOs use, and involves from start to finish, as I mentioned just now, the whole system, so that poachers are arrested safely and nobody gets hurt. But behind all this is a team of excellent women, of all female team who are our analytics team. They're actually doing wildlife crime analytics. So what they do is they compile all the data, do a bit of modeling, and then enter all the information into a smart database, in which we then get crunchy and then figure out what are better ways in which you can guide our patrol. So it's really about applying science. So a lot of us, we are trained as biologists, like most of the audience here, perhaps. We have learned a lot from crime science. We use approaches where we narrow down the space, operational space. It's not just about walking down valleys, through streams. We actually collect data. All these points you see are signs of poaching, camps and snares, and then we actually do some modeling to find out where's the ideal roadmap, and we identify high priority segments that are patrol regulated so that we can get better at finding the poachers at the right time and right place. So after doing all this science, we started in 2015 just bumbling about looking for poachers. After a while, we got better and better. And over time, after training, we have resulted in a rate success that has improved. In 2016, we had a 1 in 5 chance of getting poachers arrested. Now in 2019, we have a 1 in 2 chance. So if you're a poacher, beware, don't come to Kenya, because our team has really analyzed and crunched the data to find out where the best areas to look for you. So tigers appreciate this. For example, in this area, we had tigers who were poached out before because snares were set. And then during the pandemic, some of the tigers returned because there were no signs of poaching anymore over the last 2 years. But unfortunately, some of them coming back now, but we can see how COVID provided reprieve for tigers. So just again, thanks to all my heroes on the ground, my team is going to show you a short video of who they are and what we do during training, the example of a training session, interagency training session with not just NGOs, but wildlife
So
department.
many of us, we work in our own landscapes, in our own sites, and when we get together, especially us field operators on the ground, we observe there's so many things that we can share and we can compare notes. That really helps for us to know what's going on outside of our study areas, how all the bushcraft and all their natural skills and talents that they've grown up with, how all that can be applied to doing something like anti-poaching.
So I'm just gonna wrap up now. I've got 2 minutes left. Also, we have non-human heroes attack. We also have our first conservation canine in the forest. In theory, he track tents in the forest up to 2 days ago. Where the Singapore government has a dog in the airport, but we also have a dog in the forest. Down poachers from South Africa. Here is a Belgian Malinois. So wrapping up, what can you do as a youth to help try to reduce wildlife trade at the source? Again, find a chance to join or volunteer with a group of trained anti-poachers in Malaysia to reduce snaring and poaching in the forest. You can, if you know rich people, again, send them our way and we can point them to relevant people to fund. Also, if you are interested in wildlife crime science, join a team in Malaysia. Try to maybe even volunteer with them for a while to see how you can get involved, because ultimately we need to use science to get better at catching poachers. And in your own capacity, try to spread awareness materials through social media to write it again, as Kanita mentioned, to reduce the demand from consumers. That's key. And also lobby governments, perhaps in Singapore, logistic companies. We know they are transit countries. Try to have tighter law enforcement. Again, try to use non-humans like dogs, conservation canines, potentially a potential to get more traders and equipment, to have more products passing through the airports to get them apprehended before they go on to the source country. So again, you can catch all the poachers you want, but ultimately, I feel if without healthy forest, tigers and other wildlife won't have a place to live. So we are right now, over the next couple of years, trying to finance or look for opportunities to finance forest conservation. So we are trying to develop a voluntary carbon project right now to try to get more forest protected. We have gazetted 30,000 hectares of forest here already. It's like half the size of Singapore. It's protected already in Terengganu. We're going to expand that to 200,000 hectares. So again, we need people to work on all fronts. So it's not just about catching poachers, but having enough habitats where tigers can persist. So thank you very much, and open to questions later.
Thanks very much, Prof. Ruben. Really insightful. In the last 10 minutes, you brought us on a journey to the front lines, in terms of protected area management and the kind of important work that rangers do on the ground. Thanks very much for that. So yeah, I think there'll be a lot of questions on that, and maybe you can share more a bit later on in the panel discussion.
Thank you.
We'll move on to our next speaker. We will now welcome Dr. Klairung Phumphon, Director of Scientist Implementation and Monitoring Subdivision, Department of National Parks, Thailand. Dr. Klairung Phumphon's presentation will cover the magnitude of illegal wildlife trade and its effect on the region. She will also highlight regional and national efforts to combat illegal wildlife trade and her experiences as a wildlife law enforcement expert, collaborating across countries to combat transboundary illegal wildlife trade. Dr. Klairung, Sawadee Krap. So you have the the floor for your presentation.
Hi, thank you for introduction. So a very good afternoon to all. It is my great pleasure to speak and present in this important event, the World Wildlife Day Regional Youth Symposium. This is the first time that I joined the international event for youth. Feeling so honored and privileged to be with you here. So let me thank the organizer, the National Park Board Singapore, for organizing and giving the opportunity for me to join. And thank the audience for your attention. Next, please. So my today presentation will draw your attention to the issue of illegal wildlife trade and how it is so important in the Southeast Asian region. Also, we share with you on how the 10 countries in Southeast Asia collaborate to combat the illegal wildlife trade. Next, please. I may skip some slides because I think we have learned a lot about the overview of illegal wildlife trade in general. So in my presentation, I would like to start with this picture. It is estimated that the global illegal wildlife trade is worth between 7 billion and 23 billion a year, making it one of the most profitable criminal enterprise. So how can it make the huge profit like this? I'm giving you some idea to look at the example. This is from the African country, and it's from some research that I give you just for the overview picture of the illegal wildlife trade globally. This example is from African country. The ivory pricing in this slide marked out from the bush to retail market show the increasing value of the elephant tusk throughout the chain of trade. The ivory price can increase by 500% by time they reach African consolidation center. So in the slide, the gray line is representing the price at the community area or local area, while the red line is representing the price at the urban area. So you can see the difference. And the price can increase 4,000% by the time they reach retail market in Asia. You may observe also that the price is up when it becomes the product like Bangkok at the retail. And it is different in each area as well. From the slide, you can see the price that different in Thailand, Laos PDR, Vietnam, and China. Next, please. So because of high profit and high demand, it makes a number of animals were killed to respond to this demand. In this example, to get approximately 200 tons of ivory by weight require killing more than 200,000 of elephants. Next, please. So similar to this example, about 2,000 of bear claws could reflect that 84 bears at least were killed to get this claw. Next, please. So you can imagine how many individuals of wildlife that were killed to generate this wildlife product. Next, please. So this is another example from the product, and in this photo is the example of amulet that made of the tiger skin. Next, please. So how could the wildlife trade affect the wildlife? I would like to give some example that Thailand has faced. So in the photo, in the slides, this is the midden-sized deer that has the most beautiful antler. And this is the endemic species that can be found in Thailand only. But now it is extinct from the wild. So we don't have it anymore because of the heavy hunting in the past for the consumption and for export. So in the past time, we export this deer skin for the country revenue. And because of their habit that live in the field, not in the deep forest, so it is easily to be poached, and so finally we have lost it. And this is not the loss of Thailand, but the global. And this is the only one example of only one species from one country. Next, please. And when we consider the Southeast Asia region as the hotspot for biodiversity, while it is occupying only 3% of the Earth's surface, but its natural habitats contain up to 18% of the all-known species. The region plays the role as a source, transit, and destination markets for illegal wildlife trade. More importantly, this region has long been targeted by illegal wildlife traders as a hotspot in the lucrative multi-billion-dollar global trade of wildlife. Next, please. Next slide, please. So to protect the wildlife, we talk a lot about conservation, and many of you may realize that the most effective tool is to enforce the law, and but it might not enough now. We need to think about other options. Because the wildlife trafficking is considered a transnational organized crime that aim for the high benefit. And the organized criminal groups involve three or more people working together in the more than one country. So such group make use of sophisticated, complex transportation and financial network. So apart from legislation, the interagency cooperation is recognized as a key to successful law enforcement efforts. Up to now, several countries have adopted their wildlife enforcement networks. International cooperation action in the form of legal information sharing agreements, extradition treaties, and global wildlife task force have gained strength in recent years as well. In this slide, the list of logos showing here, sorry, back to, yes, is for letting you know that the various country and organizations who are working closely with us to combat wildlife trafficking. The most important international cooperation, I would like to mention the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES. The cooperation under CITES requires signatory parties to enact their national law to control the international trade of wildlife, to ensure that there will be no species that become extinct because of the international trade. The other intergovernmental organizations such as Interpol and UNODC are also working to support countries in combating wildlife trafficking, assist in building capacity, facilitate the operation and information exchange. It is also important that some countries implement the policy focusing on combating illegal wildlife trade and working in support other countries that are facing this problem. For example, the United States and European Union policy that has long-term support countries' efforts in fighting against wildlife trafficking. And the last partner is the other international organization and non-government organization who contribute their expert and technical assistance, financial assistance, for example, like IUCN, the Wildlife Trade Monitoring Network or Traffic, and the WWF, for example. Next, please. In ASEAN region, we have fought against the illegal wildlife trade for decades. I was there when we first established the network of 10 countries. So in this slide, I would like to mention that this is another working group under the Interpol that play important role in supporting fighting against wildlife crime, and Singapore is taking part as the executive board of this working group. Next, please. For ASEAN, we have highly committed in developing regional cooperation in addressing the illegal wildlife trade and improve law enforcement and governance through several sectoral bodies, such as the ASEAN Working Group on CITES and Wildlife Enforcement, which has the mechanism of wildlife enforcement network in each country that comprise of the cooperation at national level that get together the wildlife agency, police, custom, and other relevant law enforcement agency. We have now developed the plan of action for ASEAN cooperation on CITES and wildlife enforcement 2021 to 2025, which emphasize the importance of developing cooperation at all levels to eradicate wildlife poaching and trafficking. With this, we highlight the need of strengthened cooperation on robust legal framework, robust strategies for demand reduction, and enhanced law enforcement actions. Another ASEAN group that also working together is the ASEAN Senior Official on Transnational Crimes Working Group on Illicit Trafficking of Wildlife and Timber that prioritize the wildlife trafficking as the serious crime under the ASEAN Framework on Transnational Crime, which can support the fight against illegal wildlife trade in the region as well. So next slide, please. From my presentation until this slide, I would like to say that to emphasize that no single country can fight against wildlife trafficking and win. We all need to collaborate. And that's why I am here to emphasize most importantly, the people who are not law enforcement officers can also do their best to support fight against wildlife crime. The decade of fighting against wildlife trafficking cannot ensure that we will win this war because the wildlife crime syndicate has a strong network and dynamic, and is organized and have the effective mechanism. And the law enforcement officer usually behind them. Moreover, the rapid change of circumstance around us bring the dynamic and trend of the crime, the new trend like the illegal trade of wildlife over the internet that we are facing more and more in the present day, and this is difficult to win. But there is a thing that everyone can do, and the youth can do, is to tell people around you to respect to nature, wisely utilize the natural resource at appropriate level that never cause any damage to natural resource, and reducing demand for wildlife consumption. This effort can lead to winning the game. The illegal wildlife trade cannot be driven without a high demand. As long as the demand existing, the wildlife trafficking will be never ended. I can say this based on my experience. So in my last word, I would like to invite you on board to fight against wildlife trafficking, to stop this threat for ourselves and future generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kun Klairong, and also thanks for the invitation, to everyone to join this fight. I think it's very interesting that you talked about the supply chain, about how the turnover of the prices and between the raw products and the processed products, and also Thailand for sure does a lot of good work, having so many land borders with different countries, and also being a major air and sea port. So it's definitely very good hearing from you about transboundary type of enforcement. Thank you very much. Last but definitely not least, we'll move on to our final speaker. Today we have Ms. Sally Young. She is the Senior Legal and Policy Specialist in USAID, reducing demand for wildlife. Coming from a legal background, Sally will present an overview of the policy and legal framework on combating wildlife trafficking in the ASEAN region. Let us welcome Sally, please.
Thank you, Celine. Let me just share screen. Okay, are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Celine. And thank you, MParts, for organizing and inviting me to be a part of this symposium. I was really excited to join this symposium as it's reaching out to the youth, and the youth will be our successor in protecting the environment and our wildlife. So very briefly, I'm a Singaporean. That's why I'm so proud to do this. Working in Bangkok on USAID regional wildlife programs for the last 7.5 years, supporting ASEAN and focus countries such as Thailand in their counter wildlife trafficking legislation and policy reforms. As law and policies are the backbone, to me anyway, of combating wildlife trafficking, I shall attempt to give you a brief overview of the regional policy and legal framework on combating wildlife trafficking. It's quite impossible to be comprehensive in the time given, so my apologies for being brief and perhaps giving a much drier presentation than all the other presenters has given dealing with laws and policy. I shall touch upon the regional legal instruments and mandates that are already in place to counter wildlife trafficking in the region. What else is needed in view of the lessons from the COVID-19 outbreak and from a One Health perspective. For the presentation, the term wildlife trafficking and illegal wildlife trade, or IWT, or counter wildlife trafficking, or CWT, is going to be used interchangeably, but for all intents and purposes, they have similar context here. So ASEAN as a region has several policies to address wildlife trafficking issues. ASEAN bodies such as the ASEAN Interparliamentary Assembly, ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Agriculture and Forestry, ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Transnational Crime, and ASEAN Poll have all taken steps and made resolutions or declarations to support combating wildlife trafficking. You can see some of the logos as well as the timeline here. So on March 2019, a special ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on illegal wildlife trade was convened and hosted in Thailand. This meeting resulted in the Chiang Mai Declaration of ASEAN ministers responsible for CITES and wildlife enforcement on illegal trade in wildlife. The Chiang Mai Declaration effectively laid the platform and direction for the development of the ASEAN Regional Plan of Action, mentioned by Khun Klarong, on combating illegal wildlife trade for the next 5 years, meaning starting from 2021. This declaration highlighted the following action: the need to strengthen cooperation in addressing illegal wildlife trade in ASEAN, strengthen demand reduction efforts across the region, strengthen regional actions to tackle illicit financial flow associated with illegal wildlife trade, enhance domestic legislation to give deterrent effect to wildlife offenses, and closing wildlife markets where it contributes to IWT. As mentioned by Khun Klarong, the two main working bodies in ASEAN that deal with illegal wildlife trade are the ASEAN Working Group on CITES and Wildlife Enforcement under the Economic Pillar, the Senior Official Meeting on Transnational Crime, which has its own working group on wildlife and timber trafficking under the Political Security Pillar. In 2020, the ASEAN Working Group on CITES and Wildlife Enforcement developed their action plan for 2021 to 2025, as mentioned before, using the Chiang Mai Declaration as the policy mandate. IWT as transnational organized crime involves a number of international conventions and treaties. And it is crucial that we look at not just wildlife laws, but also other laws that can be used to investigate and prosecute wildlife crime. In the interest of time, I shall only touch on the relevance of CITES and UN Convention on Transnational Crime, the UNTOC. All 10 ASEAN member states are parties to CITES. CITES is an international agreement between governments and serves to both facilitate legal, sustainable, and traceable trade, and in more recent years to intercept illegal wildlife trade. Wildlife conservation and protection laws in many ASEAN member states were drafted or amended pursuant to CITES requirements. This may create legislative inconsistency and conflicts, as CITES does not necessarily deal with the full spectrum of law enforcement and criminalities of wildlife crimes, especially those involving transnational and organized wildlife crime. The inherent conflict of interest between CITES management and law enforcement prevails. Further, CITES covers only endangered species, classified as appendices 1, 2, 3. And that is a loophole, as zoonotic diseases do not necessarily come from CITES listed species. UNTOC, all 10 ASEAN member states are parties to the UNTOC. States that ratify these instruments commit themselves to take a series of measures against transnational organized crime, including the creation of predicated domestic criminal offenses. While there is no separate protocol, wildlife trafficking, provided it meets certain predicate criteria, does fall within the UNTOC. Now, this is important because for most part, wildlife trafficking is not a poverty crime, but that of a wealth crime, both from the perspective of the perpetrators and the consumers. If you look at the price of ivory, rhino, and tiger products, they're all high-value commodities going into tens of thousands, even millions of dollars. Now, this means organized syndicates are very often behind and profiting from the illegal wildlife trade, as you have heard from the previous presenters. So while the poor village poachers end up in jail, the kingpins of such criminal syndicates remain free. By applying laws pertaining to organized crime, money laundering, and corruption, the resources to combat illegal wildlife trade by organized criminals increases, and legal repercussions become more severe for the wildlife criminals. As what Giovanni has said, we must make them feel the pain. So Pursuant to the development of an updated ASEAN Handbook on Legal Cooperation to Combat Illegal Wildlife Trade as a key deliverable for 2021 under the 5-year plan of action for ASEAN Working Group on CITES and Wildlife Enforcement, ASEAN has conducted an updated review of the wildlife related laws and over 20 key provisions related to combating illegal wildlife trade. The good news is all ASEAN member states have laws to regulate the illegal wildlife trade. Provisions such as hunting, trading, import, export, re-export, transit, and possession are addressed in their wildlife laws. However, the ASEAN member states' laws are not consistent across the region, especially when it comes to the penalties in the region. So if you look at the chart here, using 4 key offenses relating to trading, import, export, possession, and transit as a baseline, we've mapped the imprisonment terms and fine within ASEAN region. As you can see, the penalties for wildlife trafficking offenses varies greatly amongst the ASEAN member states from 0 to 15 years imprisonment terms. If you go on to the next graph, you can see it's the same with the fines. It ranges from 0 to USD 88,000 in fines, with the highest cap at USD 380,000. The disparity of the penalties within the region means criminals can operate in countries that have lower penalties, thereby creating a safe haven for them, or a hotspot country. Penalties need to be strengthened and harmonized across the region to be effective. Basically, we need to start treating illegal wildlife trade as a serious transnational organized crime. So wildlife trafficking is a highly specialized field in criminal enforcement, which requires specialized knowledge and procedures for effective enforcement. While ASEAN was the first globally and has been successful in creating a regional wildlife enforcement network for investigating wildlife crime, there are 2 other discipline areas that can benefit from such cooperation and specialization: the prosecution and the judiciary. And that's why I call it the game changer. Very often you have the investigation, and then what happens is that the cases is brought up to the prosecution, and the prosecution unit will say, I'm sorry, this is not important enough, or it doesn't make up all the elements of the offenses, and therefore it can't go to court. Or worse still, the case is brought up to court, but the court doesn't see it as a serious crime. And so, again, having high penalties is nice, but if the judge do not give the penalty that corresponds with the seriousness of the crime, then we're losing the case here. So I have to say that there is a growing momentum for within ASEAN for the establishment of environmental court. A few ASEAN member states already have environmental divisions set within their court system. Some has trained environmental prosecutors and judges, but more needs to be done, in particular with wildlife trafficking cases, including having rules of procedure and sentencing guidelines for environmental and wildlife trafficking cases. For now, for example, in ASEAN, only the Philippines has, in their laws, appointed special counsels for the prosecution of environmental crime and dedicated rules of procedure for environmental cases. Thailand has environmental divisions in their courts, and Indonesia have environmental judges to preside over environmental cases. Having specialized prosecutors and judges as the last bastion in the enforcement continuum would be a significant game changer in the region and would set an example to the rest of the world. So I'd like to close by spending a couple of minutes on the concept of One Health. Some of you might have heard of it. The pandemic has raised the profile for the need of a One Health approach in the management of the health of the public, animals, and environment. The management of wildlife trade, both legal and illegal, forms an integral part of the One Health approach. The latest One Health operation, there are many definitions going around, but the latest one that I have seen is developed by FAO OIE. FAO is the Food and Agriculture Office, UN. OIE is the World Animal Health Organization, and WHO, you know what that is. They have a tripartite together with UNEP, UN Environment Program. And their high-level expert panel developed this definition. Oops, sorry. It says, One Health is an integrated, unified approach that aims to sustainably balance and optimize the health of the people, animal, and ecosystem. It recognizes the health of humans, domestic and wild animals, plants, and the wider environment, including ecosystems, are closely linked and interdependent. The approach mobilizes multi-sector disciplines, communities at various levels of society to work together to foster well-being and tackle threats to health and ecosystem while addressing the collective need for clean water, energy, air, safe and nutritious food, taking action on climate change, contributing to the sustainable development, and preventing zoonotic diseases transmission due to illegal wildlife trade. That's my opinion. And in the last section of this presentation, then I would like to provide a snapshot of where we are in ASEAN on the regional policy framework in IWT and One Health collaboration and coordination. So in October 2016, the ASEAN Coordination Center for Animal Health and Zoonosis was established to provide comprehensive and integrated regional approach to coordinating the approach in animal health and zoonosis measures. That was during the SARS time, if you remember. No, actually SARS was earlier, but and this includes disease surveillance, diagnosis, and control for a quick response. So it is supposed to provide policy and technical advisory support to the ASEAN Sectorial Working Group on Livestock and other ASEAN bodies in the development and implementation of regional strategies for the prevention, control, and eradication of the transboundary animal diseases and zoonoses. So because of COVID-19, the ASEAN Coordinating Council has been designated to coordinate and provide oversight to the ASEAN collective response to the pandemic. So in 2020, the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, or what we call the ACRF, was adopted at the 37th ASEAN Summit in November, which included a comprehensive implementation plan. Under its resilience strategy, the ASEAN Working Group on CITES and Wildlife Enforcement has been tasked to promote awareness on the risk of zoonotic diseases spread through IWT and to support the formulation of recommendation and policy brief to minimize this risk. This includes measures to address wildlife trafficking from the viewpoint of biodiversity conservation sector, to enhance cross-sectorial coordination on enforcing wildlife protection laws, improve wildlife habitat, and engage relevant sectors and actors to highlight the importance of nature-based solutions to prevent future pandemic. Until recently, most multi-sectorial, multidisciplinary One Health coordination effort within ASEAN do not include comprehensive wildlife and biodiversity management in their agenda, which should detail approaches to safe and sustainable wildlife use and consumption. However, ASEAN member states such as Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and the Philippines and Vietnam have initiated One Health efforts, currently putting emphasis on preventing and responding to emerging diseases. Going forward, the ASEAN ministers have committed to developing an ASEAN regional strategy on preventing zoonotic diseases transmission from wildlife trade, i.e. both legal and illegal, right? I would say that ASEAN has the framework, the mandate, the political will, commitment to do this. And I hope I have managed to give you an overview of the regional policy and legal landscape, which will assist in formulation and your understanding of what combating illegal wildlife trade takes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sally. That was a really, information-rich presentation. I think I like how you use the term, the continuum of, combating against illegal wildlife trade. It ends up ultimately in prosecution, and that's how we deter future poaching cases. Thanks very much for showing us, a broad overview of how all the different efforts, how it came from international conventions that we use, and how one of the different small differences across the region here in ASEAN. Thanks very much, Sally. I will move on to the session B panel discussion. And again, we have Prof. Ruben Kun Klai Rung and Sally here to answer some of our questions. Again, there are two categories of questions. One is on general questions and one on career advice for many of the youths that are attending here. Maybe I'll start with a general question first. What are some of the new trends that you see in your different lines of work? What are some of the new trends in illegal wildlife trade that you and your organization has observed? And if I may, I think a lot of us will touch on online trade, but maybe we can go a little bit deeper into how that online trade is actually being conducted, if that is something that we wish to talk about. Any comments on this from any of our panel speakers?
I may start. Yes, the online trade or illegal trade of the wildlife over the internet become the new trend of the wildlife crime at the moment because of we are in the circumstance that we use the social media platform to communicate, and it's like we have no border at all. So no matter you are in which part of the globe, you can order the wildlife from the internet. So this is very difficult to investigate. It's difficult to inspect and difficult to investigate because there are so many the false posts. For example, the same wildlife may have many people to post and sell the same one, and it does not mean the people who post has the wildlife actually. So they can have other people have the wildlife, and they just communicate for trade, and it's easy to move out from the social media platform. So that's very difficult. And what Thailand doing is we have the network that comprise of partner from the civil society to keep watching on the posting to sell wildlife through the social media or the online platform, and notify the Department of National Park to the hotline and other channel. So yeah, and we have the specialized task force established to handle with this online illegal trade. So that's the new thing that we have created just in recent year. And another thing I can observe that there are more illegal trade and sending through the private transportation service like DHL or the post office. So the trend of using wildlife for pet or for some personal purpose has changed, and the transportation sector has included in the circle of supply chain of illegal trade. So that's the new trend that we can observe at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Pairung. Yeah, so I mean, I think today definitely we see wildlife trade, wildlife products, illegal wildlife products. So not just on normal social media, but they have private groups, they have private line or WhatsApp or Telegram chats So what would this actually mean in terms of legal prosecution or legal basis? I'm not sure if Sally, does this add another dimension to enforcement and prosecution?
Well, one of the things that we did look into is whether the countries have adequate laws to prosecute online crimes, and ideally, of course, you have a very specific law that says you are not allowed to trade online. But also, what we need to remember is that the platform that provides such services should be responsible as well. And that is where it can be a bit of a gray area when it comes to the law. And I would say that, for China, they have very specific provisions. It's not just the people that are trading on the online platform, but the platform themselves have certain responsibility. And that's probably something, I mean, of course, you can interpret a law and says that it includes, but what would be ideal is to have specific laws on that, and that hold the platform responsible, and they are liable as well.
Right. So like it's part of the conditions on giving a license to operate.
Or revoking their license.
Yeah.
I would even go to the extent to say that to the extent that they are delinquent, right, at some point to permanently ban them from it.
Right. Yeah, that's a
in that sense.
huge economic cost for sure. So other than that, Sally, in USAID or Wildlife Asia, any other emerging trends? I mean, you shared about One Health, the One Health approach. Any other emerging trends do you see from your?
So from the policy point of view, not so much of the crime evolving. Is really. I can see a significant, even in my short experience with this field, a definite shift in working towards public-private partnership. I mean, this platform is one of it. I've worked with Thailand, Khun Khlairong. I've had the privilege to work very closely with Khun Khlairong. And it's actually one of the agenda that we have in terms of ensuring that we work together. So I'm definitely seeing that trend, and it's a good trend for stakeholders, policy makers to be working together with private sector. And when I say private sectors, they include, of course, international organization and CSO as well. There's a much closer collaboration instead of you're sitting there and I'm sitting here, and there are some things that you don't hear about,
Yeah, definitely a very positive development for sure. Thanks, Sally. Prof. Ruben, anything you'd like to share? I'm not sure if, specifically on ranger patrols on the ground, any new trends that you would like to share?
I think it's not so much new threats. I think the more and more information we find out from our interrogations with the poachers, I think that's kind of illuminating how they actually conduct the operations. And that's something for us is new, but probably has been going on for many years. For example, we find a lot of the poachers from coming from Vietnam, for example, using trawlers. So a lot of the illegal fishing off the South China Sea, they actually facilitate the transport of wildlife products to and fro source countries like Malaysia. So the more this kind of information it's already out there, but the more and more information we're getting, we are trying to actually have intel on where all these trawlers are docking, who are the intermediaries at play. I think this is the kind of information that, of course, we can't share here today, but we would like to share more with the wildlife enforcement authorities to act on, because it's not so simple. A lot of these poachers also we find are perhaps not your typical criminal. We are finding a lot of these poachers could potentially be indentured. They could be slaves. They could be kidnapped, put on forced labor onto boats and asked to send to poach in countries like Malaysia. So it's not so simple. It's about just not so simple just catching them and putting them in jail. It's a whole socioeconomic problem that we need to address. And I think that's something for me is a revelation as the more and more we do research, especially at Sunway University now. We're conducting this research with Panthera to find out the role of the Vietnamese communities in the illegal wildlife trade in Malaysia. So yeah, we're gonna put some publications out soon. So watch that space on that.
Yeah, thanks, Prof. Ruben. Earlier, you also mentioned about patrol planning and doing that training, and I know that there are a lot of sophisticated patrol management type of tools like Smart Patrol or any variations of that. Whenever these poachers are apprehended, are there indications that they are also just as sophisticated, or if not more? Are they just randomly, poaching in this part of the national park? Or do they actually have a plan following the seasons or things like that?
Well, originally when we started out doing this work, we encountered a lot of poachers in the forest who were very happy and offered us cigarettes, offered us a drink. They were probably not aware they were actually in a protected area or doing something bad. But as time went by, as more poachers we caught, and suddenly you don't see this this happening anymore. We don't see friendly poachers anymore. But so I think over the last few years, we are finding that a lot of these poachers are pretty much doing the same thing. Their tactics haven't shifted so much. It's more so that they're more stealthy now. They're not so open. They're more careful where they put their camps, where they set their snares, as opposed to when we started out the project in the first place. So it's not so much change in tactics, but just trying to be more covert when it comes to setting their snares and setting up where they set their camps. In regards to also transporting wildlife products out of the forest, you're no longer able to fit a whole carcass of an animal into the boot of your car and drive it across the country. They need to kind of boil it and break it down into bone glue, and then that's when the bone glue gets shipped off as products back to their home, to countries where there's demand. So it's also a shift in the way they process the goods that we're noticing. But in terms of the way in which they're setting out snares and poaching, it's not so much of an obvious difference.
Right. Thanks, Prof. Ruben. Okay, I'll shift to the next final question. This is more of a general question, career advice question for the youth that are, all the young people that are joining this call today. In 1 minute, what is the one advice you have for youths? Because today, we've heard from people with legal backgrounds, economics background, forestry backgrounds. What is the one advice you have for youths interested to eventually contribute to fighting illegal wildlife trade? Any thoughts on that? Maybe I'll start with Kun Klai Room. Any advice to young people everywhere in ASEAN?
Thank you. My advice it came from experience that I see that the illegal wildlife trade is difficult to be end as long as the demand is still there. So we are working more and more on reducing the demand. And in this aspect, I think all the youth, no matter where are you, you can join this effort with us, because reducing demand is like you should know about how we consume the wildlife and their product, and how to avoid consume illegally consumption of those wildlife products, and help advise other people as many as you can, that to respect the nature, not to use make use of wildlife in the illegal way, and that you can sustain those natural resources. So this is another way of combating the illegal wildlife trade by reducing the demand that driven the illegal trade. So that I would like to say to all the youth. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Kun Klairong. Sally, any advice for the youth in the call today?
Yeah, not one advice, but a few of them, but I can do it within a minute, right? I think focusing on an area such as IWT is good, but I would say don't put yourself in a box. IWT is but a small part of what it takes to ensure the survival of humanity, the environment, and all that lives on this planet. So developing an understanding of the interconnectedness of life on this planet is important. In other words, know your subject. The other one is perseverance. Doing this work, and I think many of the professionals here who has been here or doing this work for a long time can share this sentiment, is that it can sometimes be very disheartening. I used to tell people who want to do this work and say, Sally, I want to join you. And I said, well, you know, in order for you to be able to do this, sometimes you have to continue without knowing whether there's actually a light at the end of the tunnel. And that's why I say perseverance. But you know what, seeing the youth of today, I really have hope that we can make it. So to me, attitude is more important than aptitude in certain situations. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sally. So attitude, understanding of the subject matter, and perseverance. Thanks. Prof. Ruben, any final thoughts on this? I think you have the honor of closing this panel discussion.
Thanks a lot, Celine. Yeah, very good advice from our panelists here. And just to add on, if possible, again, once you are free to travel, I really encourage the youth to just go out there and explore and volunteer. I mean, volunteerism is so underrated, but also very, very important in shaping your future career. So if you can, look for all these fantastic NGOs out there, not just in Malaysia, but many around in ASEAN, which you can try and email and be persistent. Again, you know, sometimes people are busy. You're asking them for a volunteer or internship position, they might not respond to you, but if you're persistent enough and you try to put your foot in the door, I think you'll be rewarded. And I think once you get opportunity like that to work with a diversity of people, not just people from, I guess, your own ethnic background, you will be working with people. For example, in Malaysia, you may work with orang asli, indigenous people. You can learn so much from them in the forest, and not just what you learned in books in university. So if you're lucky enough to volunteer in a very diverse team, get a chance, go for it. And if you're keen on finding out more, you can just always drop an email to, I think the panelists here will be able to guide you to different NGOs, organizations in the various countries. Because at the end of the day, if you don't go, you won't know, right? So go down to the ground and see what's happening. It's not just enough looking at your phones for YouTube content and reading up articles. That's a great start, but it's a lot of intricacies and challenges that you may only encounter only once you go down to the ground. So luckily, we might be traveling soon. So take the opportunity. I know it's been a tough time for a lot of the youth the last 2 years. I'm so sorry and so very, very sympathetic to what you've been going through. And again, if you can start emailing now and look for relevant organizations to volunteer, and I think it'll put you in a better state to get into a career involves tackling wildlife crime and reducing wildlife trade. I think that's will be a great start.
Great, thanks, Prof. Ruben. So basically, you know, stay interested, be proactive, you know, apply and, you know, be involved basically in any way that you can. So volunteer as an intern. Thanks a lot. All right, in the interest of time, I only have 1 minute to close out this entire session. I think I'll just thank everybody. We've heard from a very diverse group of speakers from different countries. I think great job to the team in NParks and the youth, the YSN for lining this up together. We've heard from Dr. Adrian Du previously on the efforts in Singapore and some of the developments, from Klairong on what's happening in Thailand. And also we heard from a legal perspective from Sally, and also Giovanni from UNODC, And also we took a trip to the front lines together with Prof. Ruben. And also we heard a very broad perspective of the market surveys that Kanita has done in traffic. So very, very good lined up. Thanks a lot, everyone. I think I'll hand the time over to Anusha to take you towards the next session. Anusha, please.
Thank you, speakers, for the really fruitful discussion of sharing. And thanks a lot, Selin, for being our moderator for today. You know, your experience in this field really translates to engaging discussion. So thank you so much. So now we will proceed to our